All the world navies would adopt the decompression procedure established by Haldane, which were made public by the British Royal Navy Command. In 1912, the US Navy Diving School was founded and published its first diving manual in 1916. The Navy Experimental Diving Unit, NEDU, was established in 1927, and a testing program aimed at improving decompression procedure was launched. In 1935, the NEDU published an analysis based on more than 2,000 dives in the 30-60 meter zone. The study suggested that short-period compartments had much higher supersaturation tolerances than the 2-to-1 ratio chosen by Haldane. The authors proposed to completely disregard the 5 and 10-minute period compartments, considering that they were never limiting, and at a time when calculations were done manually, the time saving was non-negligible. They significantly increased the maximum tolerated pressure for the 20-minute compartment using a 2.8 ratio. The very first version of the US Navy air diving tables was calculated based on these three compartments. Operational use of these simplified tables showed that they were far from satisfactory, and by 1937, a revised version, still based on three compartments but with reduced ratios, was used by the US Navy divers. Despite these changes, the number of decompression sicknesses continued to increase, but World War II diverted the US Navy's resources. It wasn't until 1951 that the NEDU finally launched a campaign of tests to determine the number and values of supersaturation ratios that would better ensure the safety of US Navy divers. The study showed that short compartments were sometimes necessary, but confirmed that the ratios were much higher than the initial 2-to-1. The supersaturation ratios for long compartments were similarly increased. The authors also conclude that a long compartment should be added for deep, long immersions, and choose to use an additional 120-minute period compartment. In the mid-1950s, the first programmable calculators allowed the NEDU to develop more detailed tables than those calculated manually. Depths were indicated every 3 meters, with time interval of 10 or even 5 minutes. Officer Dwyer was in charge of developing the programming procedure. He stated that the critical supersaturation ratios should vary with depth. He even proposed a formula to describe the relationship allowing the calculation of this coefficient at any given depth, but finally abandoned this option. The new US Navy air diving tables were calculated, tested, modified, and validated in 1956. The decompression tables used by the US Navy units were still not satisfactory for long, deep immersions. The NEDU continued its work. Robert Workman, captain of the US Navy Medical Corps, first corrected the approximation made by Haldane regarding the critical supersaturation ratios. Haldane had considered that ambient pressure could safely be halved at any time. Instead of considering atmospheric pressure, Workman proposed using the partial nitrogen pressure in the air and adjusting the ratio established by Haldane. Workman adapted Haldane's hypothesis and concluded that human tissues could tolerate 1.58 times the partial nitrogen pressure breathed in. He then focused on the concept of depth-dependent ratios. Workman developed a much simpler method than the one suggested by Dwyer. He first defined the zero value, M0, expressed in feet, as the maximum nitrogen pressure tolerated at the surface by each compartment. For each compartment, he applied a linear projection, using a coefficient he called delta M, also expressed in feet, representing the nitrogen pressure to be added every 10 feet to the M0 value to calculate the tolerated nitrogen pressure in a compartment at a given depth. The decompression stop depth was determined to ensure that, in the leading compartment, the nitrogen pressure was always less than or equal to the maximum tolerated value. The duration of a decompression stop was calculated to allow the leading compartment to reach the tolerated nitrogen pressure at the depth of the next stop or at surface. Upon surfacing, all compartments contain nitrogen pressure equal to or less than the pressure they could tolerate, M0. Workmen established the M0 and delta M parameters for each compartment of the existing US Navy tables. He rounded the period of the 75-minute compartment to 80, and initially added 2 compartments with periods of 160 and 240 minutes. For the final version, published in the 1965 research report, Workman modified the parameters of the 160-minute compartment and added a ninth and final 200-minute period compartment. Workman did not present his results in table form. He proposed an equation to calculate the parameters of the different compartments using Haldane equation to calculate the decompression at any depth and for any exposure times. The path to computer-assisted decompression calculation was now open.